This is the big news of the day. It broke yesterday afternoon that Colombia begins to suspend student protesters. University officials gave the pro-Palestinian demonstrations a 2 p.m. deadline and threatened to suspend them if they did not leave. They ended up making good on that threat. They did suspend the student protesters, but news moves so fast nowadays that the suspension is really the prologue of the story, because overnight, Columbia protesters occupy Hamilton Hall as university standoff escalates. Demonstrators take over Hamilton Hall in escalation of anti-war protests. Al Jazeera reports students have taken over a building at Columbia University as the standoff between protesters against Israel's war on Gaza and the varsity authorities escalates. Protesters moved to occupy Hamilton Hall at the university in New York early on Tuesday after the management said it had begun suspending students who had refused to meet a deadline to disperse on Monday. The move threatens to escalate the standoff, which has seen protests over the Gaza war spread across the country. Video footage showed protesters on Columbia's Manhattan campus locking arms in front of Hamilton Hall early on Tuesday and carrying furniture and metal barricades to the building. Dozens of protesters barricaded the entrances and unfurled a Palestinian flag out of a window. Hamilton Hall, which protesters said they have now dubbed Hind Hall or Hind Hall, is one of several buildings that was previously occupied during a 1968 civil rights and anti-Vietnam protest on the campus. An autonomous group reclaimed Hind Hall, previously known as Hamilton Hall, in honor of Hind Rajab, a martyr murdered at the hands of the genocidal Israeli state at the age of 6 years old. Columbia University's Apartheid Divest, a coalition representing pro-Palestinian student organizations, posted on X. So here's the sign there, Hind Hall. That's where they have occupied and renamed that from Hamilton Hall. Now we're going to take a look at some of this video. Here they are outside the building. Shut it down. Now this is last night, so this is after the 2 p.m. deadline to disperse or be suspended. So these are kids who, assuming their identities will be revealed, which is why a lot of them are masked, they will face a suspension if they're identified on the campus. That's outside the building. Here's inside the building. Okay, back to the article here. Student radio station WKCR-FM broadcast a play-by-play of the hall's takeover, which occurred hours after the protesters defied the Monday 2 p.m. deadline to leave the encampment of about 120 tents or face suspension. Columbia says it has now begun enacting that threat. Protesters said on X that students plan to remain at the hall until the university concedes to their demands: complete divestment from finances in Israel, transparency about financial ties to the country, and amnesty from any disciplinary measures for all students participating in the protests. We demand our voices be heard against the mass slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza, their post said, adding that they hold Columbia University as complicit in this violence, and this is why we protest. Universities across the U.S. are grappling with growing protests with an eye on end-of-year commencement ceremonies. Some are continuing negotiations, while others have turned to ultimatums and force, which has resulted in clashes with police. So there's the report from Al Jazeera. We saw some video. The kids are not backing down. Some of them probably dispersed because they were afraid of getting suspended, and the semester is over anyway. But enough of them are saying, no, we're not leaving. We're not leaving. And it's just an inspiring thing to see. And once again, because we're going to play some video in the next semi-segment here, categorizing these as violent protests. It's important to say this every single time in every single segment because we clip these separately, and it's very important that this gets out there. The NYPD has not cited a single act of violence committed by any of these kids. Not one. On either campus, Columbia or NYU, the new school has an encampment too as of last week. I don't know if they broke that one up yet. That didn't get as much press as these other ones. That's a much smaller school, but they have one going as well. So there are at least 3 encampments that we know of happening in New York City. The New York cops have not cited a single act of violence. And so now these students are seeing their suspension threat and raising them an occupation. And, I really hope that they stick this out. And, it's imperative that they keep things nonviolent because once you cross that threshold, once you cross that line, you're going to lose everybody. So, I'm not saying this to chide you because so far they have behaved fantastically well, I think. But they have to keep that up, and they have to keep their resolve and keep their demands where they are, because you have seen schools start to make certain concessions around the edges. Russell, you were talking one before we went on the air. I forget what you were mentioning. But you have seen them start to budge.
There's school, I can't remember which one. It's in the Pacific Northwest that has suspended taking donations from Boeing.
Boeing, that's right, yeah.
Which it's a start. It's a start. The students are rejecting it as a gesture of placation because
they should reject
they have
everything.
Other ties and
no, but the fact that they're giving them something means that they are weakening, right? And
yes.
So because if you did this in 2002, 2003. Post 9/11, run up to the Iraq War. If you had an anti-war protest and you made any kind of demand, you wouldn't get shit from any of these institutions. They wouldn't budge an inch. So the fact that they're budging an inch already is a good sign.
I was reading an interview with Paul Rudd, who was one of the main student leaders of the 1968.
My father knew Paul Rudd. Yeah.
Did he really?
Yeah. Well, he hung out at the campuses. He hung out at those 1968 campuses.
Well, that's what I was going to say. He was one of the leaders of the 1968 Columbia protests before he went on to be a leading member of the Weather Underground. And he was saying there are a lot more women leaders than back in his day, and he feels that that's toning down the macho because he's saying their generation of protesters were much more prone to make violent threats. He's talking about it was a very common chant, "Hey, motherfucker," up against the wall. Right. He's saying, I'm not seeing things like that. They're not calling the cops pigs, right, which was so common in that era. And yeah, they're and this is why the NYPD can't find a single incident.
Mark Rudd, that's it. I knew something was wrong. Mark Rudd.
Mark Rudd.
Thank you.
Right.
Paul Rudd is the actor.
Thank you.
yes. I knew something was fishy about that.
That's always happening.
Yeah.
That's always happening. They're always showing up at Paul Rudd's house to question him.
Yeah, right.
Poor guy.
Paul Rudd, yeah.
So yeah, come on. I mean, this generation, American society is just not as violent anymore. I remember years ago, a friend of mine got in a bar fight and got arrested. He said, "Can't anybody just get the shit beat out of them and go home anymore?"
Right.
But it's true, man. It's true. You get into a fist fight, you assume you're going to jail. It didn't used to be that way back in the day. That would have been very rare. Anyone would have called the cops over a fist fight. Now they'd almost universally do it. People just don't throw hands like they used to.
Well, this thing about, on the question of tactics, right? And, because Norm Finkelstein, caused a little bit of controversy.
Oh, Norm?
What else is
Norm
new?
did?
Right, yeah.
Really?
Because he went there and he says, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" is not a good slogan to use. He says you should tweak that to say that Palestinians should be free meaning you're not talking about a political takeover of land, you're just talking about equal rights. He's parsing it there, right? He's parsing it as academics
Well,
tend
if you
to.
remember, we asked him about the right of return, and he didn't want to answer that.
Right. Yeah. Well, because I think Norm feels, and the first time we interviewed Norm, I had a little bit of a back and forth with him, not about this issue, but about prison abolition, defund the police, right? He's very critical. He's very critical of slogans that he feels give ammunition to the other side of the argument or that are not realizable, in short time. He said, radicals have a responsibility to advocate for things they can actually do because the action is the main thing. And I get that. Like, I respect that. On the other hand, he came up at a time where change was possible, right? I mean, during the civil rights movement, change was possible. We saw change. We live 50 years outside of that, or 60 years outside of that now, where the system has become so corrupted by money and all kinds of international interests that what's possible is very, very limiting. So if you're going to limit your rhetoric to what is achievable in the short term, you're going to end up sounding like a fucking mainstream Democrat, because you could say Medicare for all is not doable in the short term. So should we not advocate for that? Should we advocate for a public option? Because that's what Joe Biden does, right?
Right.
So I
Right.
think the times are a little different to the point where you can't be that constrained. And I got into it with him a bit the first time we interviewed him. This was long before, October 7th. But as with regards to like that slogan, I think we have to be very firm in the stance that we are the normies. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is a normie, benign, unthreatening phrase. If that triggers you, it's because you're a fucking racist. You're the one who's not normal. We have to own that and really be very firm on that. And so I don't agree with that. Now, the reason I bring that up, because that may seem like a bit of a non sequitur, is because I think our rhetoric should be firm. It should be bold. We should insist that, of course, free Palestine on Palestinian land, whether you call that Palestine or Israel, that's a question downstream of that. I brought that up on the Jimmy Dore show with Max last night. But there's no question that on that land, there should be equal rights for everybody. Everyone who is against that is the non-normal person. Normal people believe in equal rights for everyone. So if you have a problem with that, that's your problem. But the reason I bring this up, not to be long-winded, is that when it comes to rhetoric, we should be bold and firm. When it comes to nonviolence, you must stay committed to nonviolence, because if you do not stay committed to that, then our narrative falls apart. Our narrative falls apart. These Zionists are the ones out there threatening people. These Zionists say things that we can't even repeat on this channel because we get in trouble for quoting them. That's how vile they are. So let them occupy that space. Rhetorically, we'll be uncompromising, and occupying a building is not hurting anybody, right? Civil disobedience is part and parcel of any protest movement. We have to own the fact that we are actually the normies here. The radicals are the people making excuses for the constant murder of children. Those are the radicals. We're not radicals. We're normal people who believe everybody should be able to live equally and in peace. There's nothing threatening about that. There's nothing particularly outside the bounds about that. Not whatsoever. And so it's important to own that.
Yeah, you have tended we've tended to disagree about sloganeering. We never agreed about defund the police. I was always on the other side of that. In this case, I agree with you though, because the underlying demand is the only reasonable demand here.
Right.
It is, whereas I felt defund the police was overly confusing in terms of what it meant. Because if you talk to people about what it actually meant, it meant what I thought you should be advocating, to reroute the funds into other areas, to reroute it into mental health services. Sure. And I feel like when you said defund the police, it was just too easy to interpret it as, this is Thunderdome. We're just going to not have police, right? It was too easy. This, from the river to the sea, insofar as people are confused by it, it's actually worth explaining it, because that is the only worthy aim of any movement regarding this region. You want to forcefully forcefully take on the idea that a two-state solution is a solution, because as we have seen in the past, even if what you want or what you think is feasible is to leave this apartheid state, this ethno-state intact with the Palestinians living on their own land, Israel will never allow it. Israel only uses those discussions to play for time so that they can gradually impose more settlements, de facto take over more land. That is that Israel is playing a from the river to the sea game. It's just a game where there are no more Palestinians within that territory from the river to the sea. So you want to forcefully shut down discussion of a two-state solution. You don't want people getting sidetracked into that. So from the river to the sea opens up that conversation. It is valid, and you're right. You can't let them define that as anti-Semitic, which is what they're doing with all of this. And again, it's absurd on the face of it. Yes, the wokest, most identity-obsessed generation in history, all of a sudden, hundreds of university campuses around the country are exploding with Kristallnacht style anti-Semitism.
Please clap.